Brett Dolter is an ecological economist at the University of Regina. Brett, what was your reaction when you went over the climate change strategy the province announced today?
Mixed feelings. First thought was I was glad to see some real policy in there. So glad to see that they have these policies in place to reduce emissions in the electricity sector, to help the oil and gas sector get a handle on their methane emissions, to put in place a building code that's going to help new homes and new commercial buildings become more efficient. So quite happy to see real policy efforts in those areas. I didn't think that there'd be a carbon price because we've heard loud and clear there wouldn't be, but I still look to this plan and say, does it achieve what a carbon price would have achieved?
So how does it compare to putting a price on carbon and instead having this offset system? Because ultimately the goal is to reduce emissions. So how does it differ from that?
Well, yeah, when you come to look at what are some real climate change policies that are going to lower emissions, people talk about two kinds. There's regulatory approaches, or pricing, carbon tax, cap and trade. The government's gone with a regulatory approach, and that can achieve emission reductions. The question is, will it achieve them at an efficient, cost-effective way? So will it provide those incentives for innovation, for people to look beyond just meeting a standard and actually look to go beyond the standard? Will it create those new markets for entrepreneurs who want to help people conserve energy or become more energy efficient? So those things aren't as strong in a regulatory approach as they would be if you put a price on carbon.
This is largely built around keeping business interests happy in Saskatchewan. Do you think it will work?
Well, for the large industrial emitters, the provincial plan offers some flexibility, it looks like. So they're planned to set output-based targets. So you have to reach a certain performance standard for your emissions intensity, and that I guess will vary by industrial sector. That should help with competitiveness pressures. So they're not asking industry, one way to do a carbon tax would be industry has to pay on every ton. That would be hard on industry because they're trading in international markets and they'd have to try to pass those costs along, but they probably couldn't, so that would hurt their competitiveness. This plan says you don't necessarily have to pay for every ton, and you just have to meet a performance standard. You could also design a carbon price that does the same thing, and that was the federal government's plan. Their backup plan would be very similar to what Saskatchewan has proposed. Propose a standard, and if you don't meet the standard, you have to pay a price for the emissions above what you should have achieved. So what the Saskatchewan plan is opens up the door not to just pay for the emissions in terms of $1 per ton, but instead to look at buying carbon credits or finding what they call flexible mechanisms for compliance. So it's comparable for the big emitters, and I think that they should be happy that it shouldn't affect their competitiveness too much.
And what about environmentalists? How will they see this plan?
Well, I think that you have to be happy to see a plan that goes beyond what some would call a faking it approach. So the faking it approach is provide incentives, provide information, talk a good game, talk about what you should do without putting anything in place that has a bit of bite to it. Regulation has a bite to it. People have to meet the standard. The oil and gas sector will have to reduce their methane emissions. Electricity sector will have to reduce their emissions intensity. So that should mean that this is going to be an environmentally effective plan. Carbon pricing is the other way to put in place a plan that has some bite to it that would be effective.
All right, thanks for your time today, Brett.
You bet.